Namaste and good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to what promises to be a very heavy-hitting Vijarmanthan. As our regular attendees will know, Vijarmanthan, or VM for short, is a platform that earnestly explores issues facing modern society. Here, we dive into the ocean of human experience and knowledge, churn ideas, and examine what emerges through a Hindu civilizational lens. In short, here at VM, we believe that ideas matter, and our approach to these ideas define us as a society. We will follow our usual format this evening. I shall first invite our speakers to share with us their opening remarks, followed by a panel discussion, and finally, we will have an audience Q&A, where you, our audience at home, will have a chance to pose questions to our expert panel. I encourage you to get involved and look forward to hearing from you. This evening, we are shining a spotlight on universities. As both melting pots and battlegrounds for ideas, universities play a vital role in our society. They are the training grounds for the next generation of thought leaders and act, or should act, as bastions of earnest inquiry. Relatively recently, we have seen a rise in cancel culture and no platforming. Both of these are symptomatic of an underlying shift in our approach to ideas. The list of academics and public figures that have been cancelled or no platformed across the Western world is simply astounding. I'll take this example. In April this year, Trevor Phillips, the first Black president of the National Union of Students and a former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Britain. He was condemned as a racist and labelled a coon. In response to this, he said, "Any attempt to ask whether aspects of minority disadvantage may be self-inflicted is denounced as blaming the victim. Instead, we are expected to say that every problem faced by minority communities is all about white racism." Unfortunately, such examples are not rare, and listing them would take the whole evening. Indeed, before this, Professor Marinoff sent me a whole slew of examples from both America and Canada. Here to discuss the nature and depth of this issue and signpost us towards how we, as a society, may begin to develop an intellectual immune system within our universities, we have two leading lights of academia, Professor Lou Marinoff and Dr. Stephen Hicks. Now, those of you who joined our Sustainable Narratives conference will be familiar with Professor Marinoff, as he has garnered many fans in the VM audience for his energetic and direct style. Professor Marinoff is Professor of Philosophy at the City College of the University of New York. He is the founder of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. Alongside this, he's also an internationally best-selling author. His books include Plato Not Prozac and The Middle Way, which are masterful in their applications of philosophical traditions to the problems and challenges of everyday life. I highly recommend them to you. Professor, welcome back to VM. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you very much, Ravi, and greetings to my colleague, Stephen, and also thanks to VM for inviting me back. I'm very pleased to be here.
Always fantastic. Our second expert witness today, Dr. Hicks, is Professor of Philosophy and Executive Director of the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship at Rockford University. He is the author of Explaining Postmodernism, Nietzsche and the Nazis, and most recently, Liberalism, Pro and Con. Those familiar with his work will know that he is an outspoken champion of free speech within the academic space, and it's an honor to have him join us today. Professor Hicks, welcome to VM.
I'm honored by the invitation and pleased that Professor Marinoff is my co-panelist.
Fantastic. So we'd like to get straight into it. For our opening remarks, I'd like to start with Professor Marinoff. Lou, in 8 minutes, can you outline for us what should the role of universities be and where do you see them failing in this role?
Well, this is a tall order. Let me back up to something that was said in the opening remarks. So this is not a new problem. Cancel culture is only the most and latest public manifestation of a problem that's been brewing in my living memory since the 1960s, when a variety of counterculturalists took all kinds of action in order to change society, and many of us succeeded in doing so in very productive ways. That included the civil rights movement in the US. It included the hippie movement. I'm a recovering hippie and I can speak very loudly for its virtues, but also there were elements of the hard left within that constellation of activists. And the hard left never went away. Most of the hippies grew up. And we've seen tremendous accomplishments of civil rights in the US and elsewhere. The hard left ensconced itself in the universities, and thereby, therein lies the root of the problem. Let me explain. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci said that one could bring down a civilization without firing a shot if one could commandeer its cultural institutions. This is exactly what is transpiring today throughout Western civilization. Now it's turned violent, of course, in the US, with radical left empowering mobs to terrorize corporations and ordinary citizens alike. Appeasing the radical left with this cancel culture reminds me of Churchill's aphorism about feeding the crocodile in the hope that it will eat you last. Now, let me fire off a broadside and a number of talking points that will illustrate the nature of this cancer of political correctness and totalitarian imposition of the far left, the hard left, the cultural Marxists, to name them, who have indeed commandeered the institution and then have graduated for the last 40 years cadres of apparatchiks and political commissars who have basically infected the whole K-12 system. I mean, it's not an accident. There's suddenly a hue and cry in the US that children in grade school are being taught critical race theory, that white children are taught that they should be accusing their parents of being criminals of some kind or other. And if they object to this in any way, shape, or form, then they're denounced. These are small children. It's not an accident that Canada has legislatively introduced about 72 mandatory pronouns in order to further the agenda of deconstructing sex, replacing it with gender, and then alchemizing gender in all kinds of ways in order to confuse particularly young males so as to further demonize maleness and masculinity. I will enumerate some very quick points for you in the time remaining, and then invite you and your audience to come back to any one of them that grabs your interest in particular. So a quick few bullet points in the time remaining. I'm basically what used to be called a classical liberal, and I am now forced to be a conservative because the left has driven so far left that I can no longer identify with them. My turning point came in 1993. I'm actually a political refugee from Canada. When I went on the job market in the early 90s, I was told by the Canadian Philosophical Association, and I quote, "There are too many white male philosophers in Canadian universities." Imagine someone saying there are too many black male basketball players in the NBA. Imagine somebody that would be racism to assert. Anyway, you understand my point. So fortunately, I found a career in the United States, but I am technically a political refugee from Canadian feminism. There being no history of slavery in Canada, feminists there have the front seat, the driver's seat, when it comes to imposing cultural Marxism. My farewell gift was a satire on political correctness and radical feminism called Fair New World, and you can get it on my website. It began as satire, however, it's ended as prophecy, unfortunately. It's now in its 25th year edition, 25th anniversary edition, and I encourage you to read it. Let's go to some quick points. The cancel culture that you alluded to is made possible by one thing mainly, and that is the deliberate conflation of offense with harm. Cancel culture depends on having indoctrinated people that if in some way they take offense at something that's said, then they've been harmed or entitled to a punitive remedy against the utterer of the so-called offensive speech. This is a deliberate and an absolutely catastrophic conflation. Look, if someone harms you in any just society, you have in fact a right not to be harmed. And if someone inflicts a harm, it's a harm that you are not willing normally to accept, and you can indefinitely apply for a remedy. The perpetrator perpetrator can be brought to justice, whether it's a physical harm or harm to your interests. However, you cannot be offended against your will. You have to be willing to take offense. Offense can only be offered, unlike a harm. You can refuse it if you wish, but by equating it with harm, people have been brainwashed into thinking that if they're offended, therefore they've been harmed and they can seek a remedy by punishing the so-called offender. In effect, this is lunacy. It makes everyone responsible, note, for everybody else's state of mind. I must be afraid to say what I ought to be free to say in case I offend somebody, and I'm made responsible for their state of mind. So you're responsible for everyone else's state of mind, but note, not for your own. This is complete lunacy. Second, the toxic poison of identity politics. These cultural Marxists are driven solely by waking up in the morning and seeing the world through a distorting lens of race, class, and gender. They've completely dehumanized people by treating them in this ephemeral, this basis which does not at all look at the character, the contents of the character, the things that make us truly human, whether it's Atman as Brahman, whether we're all children of God, or whether we're simply virtuous people developing fulfillment by practicing virtues. This is totally disregarded. Everyone is judged on what has least merit. One knows nothing about about the moral character of another merely by their skin color or their sex or their gender. That tells us nothing about a person. What's really important is a person's moral compass and their ethical predispositions. This is what is important. Identity politics totally disregards that. Postmodernism is a Trojan horse that was wheeled into the academy in the 60s, thanks to Derrida and Lyotard. Lyotard was a Trotskyite. And essentially, his mission was to destroy Western culture, Western civilization. It's very largely succeeded. Cultural Marxism was hidden inside the Trojan horse of postmodernism. First, they deconstructed all the grand narratives that had knit the fabric of our civilization together. And then they were able to inject these venomous doctrines of cultural Marxism. The war on patriarchy is another aspect. Radical feminists hijacked women's liberation and have turned it into a resentful crusade against patriarchy, masculinity, men, boys, and the nuclear family.
Professor, if you could make your final point.
Anti-realism, overgeneralization, the myth of underrepresentation, the fatuous belief that equal opportunity has to lead to equal outcomes, or there's some boogeyman in the works, namely institutional racism or sexism, that has to be corrected again with social engineering on a reified charge that does not bear the light or the scrutiny of evidence. This goes on, but those are my main points. The way to address this cancer was to cut it out when it was operable. Now we need to reconstruct on its ashes.
Yes, well, we'll dive into how we deal with this issue, I think, in our panel discussion. But thank you very much for that. I think you've covered a very wide breadth, and also I think reiterated some of the earlier discussions that we had on the last sustainable narratives. I'd like to come to Stephen Hicks now for your opening statement. Could you outline the sort of nature of these ideas and the evolution of these ideas that's now permeating into the academy, and really the intent behind these ideas?
Well, I think the intent is to subvert entirely the ideal of liberal education that came to prominence early in the modern era, and then as a result of the Enlightenment of the 1700s and on into the 1800s, came to be in our cultural DNA. And we start saying that this is Western culture, but that's to some extent a historical accident as these ideas have spread and we really are in a global culture. Now, that was a centuries-long battle against earlier forms of intellectual authoritarianism, that there were some special individuals who had the truth. Everybody else was passively to accept these truths and regurgitate them in approved fashion. And you didn't need to pay attention to alternative ways of looking at things because there weren't any legitimate alternative ways of looking at things. All of the major truths have already been discovered and captured in appropriate texts or in the minds of the authority figures. So the ideal of liberal arts education that is now being assaulted is not coming from a kind of a pre-modern, old-fashioned authoritarian, but it is most broadly a postmodern. So I think the important thing is to recognize the elements of what's being attacked and why it is so fundamental. So if we talk about a liberal education, the idea there fundamentally, as the name suggests, is that you need to free your mind, and that human beings are intelligent, potentially intelligent individuals. We're not particularly physically strong or robust, but we survive, we flourish to the extent that cognitively we are able to understand the world, shape our characters, including all of the offshoot social interactions that we are going to engage in. And the ideal of liberal education was then to say we need to train individuals to have the kinds of minds so they can live successfully a free life, morally, politically, economically, religiously, and so on. And the idea here is that this is a very difficult project. That the way that human beings learn is not by passive indoctrination, but rather by experiencing the world, trying conceptually to put different formulations together. In scientific method, we say different hypotheses, but then subjecting those hypotheses to strong criticism. And you have to train yourself to be able to do that yourself, but also socially. It's absolutely important because the world is complicated, and we all know that we come in initially with partial evidence. And so other people's understanding of the evidence is important in the way they put it together. So the ideal of a liberal education is for the young mind to come in and be confronted with rather all of this data, all of these different perspectives, the important ones, and to be challenged by their professors, challenged by the other students, and it's ongoing discussion. And then out of this, you are going to free your mind from your limited circumstances. You're going to open your mind. You're going to learn how to learn, as well as acquiring a huge amount of stuff. And this is important for the modern world, because if we think about the kinds of lives we want people to live, we want people, some of them, to go on to be artists, to be scientists, to be engaged in the political process, to have successful romantic relationships, to start families and raise the next generation of children who can then do the same sorts of things. We want them to be able to manage a complicated scientific and technological society such as the one that we have. And we also think that given that all of these matters are complicated, and while we're optimistic we figured out a significant amount of stuff, there's still a huge amount of stuff that we don't know. And the only way we're going to figure out that new stuff is by having certain habits of mind in place. And that's going to require then open-mindedness to the evidence, a sense of individual agency, that you are controlling your mind, that you can change your mind on important matters, that you are willing to socially enter into the fray, put your opinions out there, have them be attacked. And you want them to be attacked. You want your ideas to be attacked, because if you can successfully defend your ideas, then you are stronger as a result of withstanding the criticism. On the other hand, if you find that there is some big mistake that someone is pointing out, a mistake of fact, a mistake of logic, you're also grateful for that. So a bruising, contesting context of education is absolutely important, and that's what liberal education should be in the best and highest sense. Now, that's exactly what is being attacked. All of those elements, the idea that evidence matters, that individuals can think for themselves, that individuals need to be aware that there are many different ways of looking at things, to be able to step outside of their own framework and adopt other frameworks, at least temporarily, to be willing to change their mind. All of that is not believed by the postmodern and other critical thinkers that Professor Marinoff was leaving. It's coming from a very different philosophical basis. As a result, we get those symptoms. For a liberal education properly conceived, we do need to have area experts, but those area experts, as well as delivering a huge amount of knowledge to young people, they need to realize that it can't just be authoritative. They need to set a context within which those younger minds are going to feel free to explore, feel free to challenge, feel free to put out stupid questions. And we always try to tell our students there are no stupid questions. Of course, there are lots of stupid questions, but the stupid thing is not asking the stupid question and putting it out there. So an atmosphere of benevolence and encouragement and challenge, and showing students how to challenge and develop the intellectual resilience, the emotional resilience, and the social habits of shared exploration and so on. So those are precisely what we find being attacked by the postmoderns and the critical thinking. Instead of any sense of benevolence, there's this, of course, guilty from the get-go. Instead of the idea that we are exploring ideas, we have the sense that the answer is already known, the right position is already set, and you had better believe it. Instead of accepting that other people will fail, they will make lots of mistakes, and encouraging people to fail and make lots of mistakes, because that's how the learning process goes. A strong atmosphere of fear. If you say the wrong thing, if you make the mistake, you will be sent to some form of social hell, and the punishments will be brutal upon you. So what we end up then with is the exact opposite of a liberal education. And now my phrase for it is that it's a postmodern education, both philosophically and in terms of pedagogy, but it's attacking all of the fundamentals of modernism, all of the fundamental kind of liberal Enlightenment ethos that we have worked to develop so hard over the course of the couple of centuries. Now, this is important because we're not going to train entrepreneurs, we're not going to train scientists, we're not going to train artists who are going to be able to elevate us. We're not going to be training people who know how to have healthy romantic relationships and healthy family relationships, to the extent that we think education is a matter of there's a party line, indoctrination, and fear. Instead, what we know is with young people, if fear takes over their minds, there are physiological changes to one's mind, as well as psychological changes to your mind. Your thinking shuts down. Your capacity for entertaining certain things shuts down. And we know anger responses, hostility responses are the exact response to that. And we then have a stagnant set of individuals who are going to generate a stagnant conflictual culture. So those are my initial remarks. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. I think you covered the sort of key fundamental principles that should be embedded within a liberal education system. And hopefully our audience is familiar with the Enlightenment principles that transitioned into the modern age that you referred to. I'd like to actually come back to Lou here and sort of pick up that you said you classed yourself as a liberal, but now you transitioned into being a conservative. So what I'd like to do is invite you to, for the purpose of this discussion, really define what is it that we mean when we say to be truly liberal. What does it mean to be truly liberal? Professor, you're on mute.
Yes, for mute is rare for me. It's more or less, to be truly liberal is to be what Stephen said. It's to be a product of the Enlightenment and understand something very important about liberalism. Liberalism, as Stephen has just explained, it not only tolerates, but also encourages and necessitates debate. The whole purpose of presumption of innocence in a legal system is to have what John Stuart Mill called the contending opinions on the matter. We present evidence from the prosecution, evidence from the defense, and then let a jury of our peers weigh that evidence in the balance of justice in order to arrive at a verdict. If you don't have evidence being presented on both sides of a debate, then how can you possibly arrive at a just decision? And the arena of scientific inquiry is just the same. New theories are winnowed again and are very grudgingly accepted because they have to stand the test. But if you have a totalitarian system that imposes a monolithic doctrine on everyone, which is what's imposed in the universities today, any kind of dissent is shut down, any kind of critique, any kind of rebuttal is forbidden, and people who offer it are censured or fired or basically canceled. And so there is no discussion. There's only a closing of minds. This has been noticed and there has been protests in every decade that this problem has worsened. What it means for me to be a liberal is to endorse what Matthew Arnold said. The purpose of a university is to teach the best that has been thought and said.
Fantastic.
Full stop.
I think so that to me, and it seems very pleasant. It seems like you would approach life with a sense of fearlessness, and you're seeking to engage. And to some extent, it would bring a happiness or joy in that exploration of life. So it seems very logical to do that. Now clearly, these postmodern ideas or postmodern education, as Stephen called it, has permeated in our system. So I'd like to come to Stephen and say, with the ideas of the Enlightenment or liberalism being so naturally logical, how is it that these seemingly contradictory ideas have permeated so ubiquitously?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues here. I think of a charming anecdote back in, it's about 100 years ago from now, when the sale of alcohol was prohibited in the United States. And there was kind of an unholy alliance of lobbyists who brought this around, and it's called the bootleggers and the Baptist phenomenon. And so what you had was people who were convinced that alcohol was immoral and bad and evil and a tool of Satan, and that on moral grounds, we needed to have laws that prohibited people from drinking alcohol. But we also had another group of people, and that was organized crime, who was, these are the bootleggers who were involved in smuggling alcohol and creating illegal forms of alcohol. And they were criminals and they were organized, so they had no problem with flouting the law. But what was interesting was that they realized that if alcohol sales became illegal in the United States, then they would control the market, and the US government would then be putting all of their competitors out of business. And what you then had was an alliance behind the scenes between the Baptists, who were arguing on moralistic grounds that alcohol was bad, and the bootleggers, who were criminals, arguing that it was bad, but they were getting together and lobbying. And so what you had was the bootleggers using the Baptists as a cover story, and the Baptists then using the bootleggers as the muscle to achieve their very end. But the point is that both of them are opposed to any sort of liberalism that says we should trust people to make their own decisions about alcohol consumption and hold them responsible for the results. Now, I think we find the same thing happening in higher education right now. There are people who have a certain understanding of what morality is. They will call their official theory is social justice, as they have a certain understanding of equality and how the relationships go. And they are true believers in that belief, but they don't necessarily have very good arguments for their position. They're not necessarily aware of the alternatives, but they are like the Baptists, by analogy here, evangelists for their position. And they don't think that they really need to consider the other side's arguments because they are so convinced of the rightness of their position. And they are willing then to use any power within the institution, the university, to achieve their ends. At the same time, we do have a large number of people who are much more analogous to the bootleggers. These are people who are very jaded and cynical, who want to argue there is no truth, there is no justice, life is just about a power struggle to get what you want, and everybody's out to try to screw me, and I'm out to try to screw everyone. And I might tell some pretty stories about, as a matter of moral color, but really what I want is power, and I want to destroy any adversaries who are going to undercut my power. So if you want to control the university, or you want to control whatever institution, the liberals, in the classical sense, are your enemy. But at the same time, as you are engaged in your power seeking to undercut the liberal education and to take over the institution, you will use the Baptists, so to speak, that is to say, the true believers. So we have an unholy alliance of true believers with power seekers, and both of them want to subvert liberal education.
Now, if I can push you a little bit further, so I've got a quote from your book explaining postmodernism. And you said, in postmodern discourse, truth is rejected explicitly, and consistency can be a rare phenomenon. And I think that's what you were sort of signposting to, that these ideas that are attached to the postmodern education are seductive, in that they're attached to things that we naturally would think are good, anti-racism, gender equality, sometimes green issues. So how is it that we as a society can untangle this? So I'm going to come to Stephen first, and then I'd like to bring Lou in on this one as well.
Well, how we can well, that's of course another a huge project, but the fundamental confidence that we have to have is that we are competent to take on life, existentially and cognitively. And so if we think that's right, then we're going to try to figure out what the truth is. If we don't think we have the truth, we're going to figure out what the best hypotheses are, and we're going to be open-minded. But what we then have to contend with is the whole battery of skeptical and relativistic arguments that a properly educated person is going to come to grips with as a part of their education. And absolutely, we do have to deal with those challenges. But if you are an intelligent young person, you are confronting those skeptical arguments, and you don't see any answer to them, right, then what you are going to be led to is the position that says, I have to give up on the idea of truth. I think that's a chimera. I don't think there is any such thing. I have to give up on the idea that of knowledge, or even any sort of standard by which I can say that some hypotheses are better than other hypotheses, or any objectivity as a regulative ideal in my thinking. So if I buy into the skeptical arguments, objectivity, truth, knowledge, better and worse hypotheses go out the window. What am I left with? All I have is my beliefs that I happen to have, however I acquired them, and they are subjectively held. But at the same time, I'm a human being, and we are passionate beings, and we want to have meaning and significance. So all you're left with is the idea is I've got a subjectively held set of beliefs and values. They matter to me, but I think everybody else is in the same boat. There's no way we can rationally and objectively resolve our differences and strive toward the truth. It really then just is a subjective power struggle. And the person who is most able to succeed in the power struggle is going to be the winner. So to go back to Lou Marinoff's analogy to the courtroom, the way we have the procedures in place that we do in the courtroom is that we think that jurors and judges can be objective, that if the facts are presented to them and presented to them logically, they can put it together, and most of the time they are going to reach the truth. And justice is a real thing. And so we're going to jealously guard those procedures because we think those are objective procedures that point us in the direction of truth and justice. If you abandon the idea that there really is truth and that there is justice, then the rest doesn't matter. And then we are just left with the stereotypical lawyer, and we see this person in the movies and in the TV shows who will quite cynically say, there's no truth, there is no justice. Instead, the courtroom is just an arena for rhetoric. And whoever has the most powerful rhetoric, whether I'm making up facts and I can get away with it, whether I'm engaging in emotional appeals, whether I can bribe jurors or blackmail them or otherwise intimidate them, the goal is power in the courtroom, and not justice, not truth, not any of that nonsense. And so it's just a power struggle. So that exact same analogy from the courtroom applies to higher education right now.
So I can see Lou nodding there. So Lou, if you'd like to come.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, this is the first time Stephen and I have actually met, but we obviously are on the same page. What he said earlier, I say to my students in every class, philosophy, I tell them there's no such thing as a stupid question. Some of them are shy. I say you should always ask. There are no stupid questions. If you ask enough philosophers, you will probably get some stupid answers, but you must always be inspired to inquire. Look, postmodernism has hoodwinked people. It's basically it's a bait and switch. By deconstructing everything, they convince people of such platitudes. I call them transparently false, such that a child could see through them. If I tell you, Ravi, in truth, there is no truth. Yeah. It's really true that there is no truth. Excuse me, that's self-contradictory nonsense. Right? If there is no truth, then the statement there is no truth cannot be true either.
Yes.
And a child could see through this. Secondly, there is no reality. It's same problem. In reality, there is no reality. Yes, nothing is real, and that's the real position that you have to take. And that would be just stupid and dismissible in a matter of minutes, but it comes larded with a much more insidious moral pecking order, because the real truth, although there's no truth, the real truth they want to convey is Thrasymachus's charge in the Republic, one of the leading darknesses of our current predicament, namely Stanley Fish, if I'm allowed to name names, made sure to remove Plato's Republic from the curriculum, broadly speaking, wherever he could, so that students would never learn that this charge was brought up in Athens and this cynic, Thrasymachus, said to Socrates, justice is only the interest of the stronger, what Stephen just recapitulated. And indeed, most of the Republic is devoted to refuting that charge. Justice is not the interest of the stronger, nor is it perfect, but the contending system we have is certainly an approximation that's much better than its variants. One example about this, I led a public forum in a Manhattan bookstore for 7 years. Every month for 7 years, Philosophers Forum. We had all kinds of New York intellectuals in there, a real hotbed. Let me tell you, fasten your seatbelt for this. And we discussed issues in that bookstore that could not be discussed on the campuses of our universities for reasons we've all enunciated. And one night we were talking about truth. And I asked the audience a question, about 40 of them. What's 1 + 1? And most of them were willing to say 2, but many not. And this, I'll never forget this girl whose parents had sent her to a very expensive university whose initials are Brown. And she said that she would not say what 1 + 1 was in case, she said, if I said it's 2, I don't want to offend anyone who believes that 1 + 1 is 3. The irony being, excuse me, the irony being that her parents paid a fortune for her to be turned into a potted plant, and the bursar's office at that university counted every penny. And if she was 1 penny short or 2, they would have let her parents know. But she had been taught not to say that 1 + 1 was 2. Do you see the absurdity of this?
We do. So we're going to come to the funding issue later on. But one thing that you said is that it's so simple that a child could see through this. Now, there's 2 things I'd like to bring up. Is clearly when these narratives exist and we see them in the media, the public is taken in by them, at least to some degree. You know, when you see an article saying Professor XYZ was removed for his position for racism, the natural tendency for an individual is to say, of course, racism should not exist in our institutions. So the first part of my question, and I'm going to direct this one to Stephen, is how do we as individuals, and this is directed more to the public than to universities, sort of discern when we're reading material or media where the truth lies, for want of a better word? And secondly, the postmodern arguments, are we in danger of straw manning them as a simple sort of muddying of the waters? Is there anything more to them?
Well, I think there's a lot more. As Lou was suggesting, going all the way back to the Greeks, skeptical arguments are a part of the Western intellectual tradition. And any person who gets a halfway decent education learns that there are on most important issues at least 2 substantive positions that disagree with each other, and they will argue back and forth, and then a third skeptical position that says it's pointless having this debate because nobody can know the truth anyway. So it's always at least a three-way debate. So I don't think there's any hoodwinking that is going on for educated people. It becomes a judgment call once you've gotten your education in here are the positive accounts of truth, reality, justice, and so forth. And here are all of the skeptical undercuttings of them. What do you think? And if you make a judgment call, well, if truth is difficult sometimes, objectivity requires a lot of effort. Maybe sometimes I shouldn't be making the claim that I have knowledge, that I should be open-minded, but I'm going to go down that road and continue to work hard to try to be objective and attend to the facts and seek the truth. Or am I just going to give up on the entire project? And that's the fundamental fork in the road. The modernists are still saying knowledge and objectivity are possible. We actually have a lot of it, but it's an ongoing difficult project. And even scientific method needs fine tuning and upgrading as the stuff that we're studying becomes more difficult. And those who have abandoned ship on this project and want therefore to subvert the ship and take things in a different direction. Now, the problem is going to be then for people who are outside of the academic world. And those debates should continue in higher education. When you have the issues of the moment, and I don't mean to trivialize racism, sexism, and all of those issues. They are They are issues. They're modern issues. And so there is a kind of division of labor, and there's a great deal of benevolence traditionally toward institutions of higher education. So if an institution is trying to clean house and get rid of someone they think is substandard or has violated some substantial moral clause, initially the benefit of the doubt is going to be that the university is doing a good job. So I think what the person who is not inside the institution, though, has to be aware of is that one of the tools for getting rid of your ideological opponents is a false accusation of something or other. And if you can loudly and proudly and push all sorts of populist buttons right on that score, then most people will not investigate very further. So if you want to stick the knife in the back, but at the same time, pretend that you are a knight of virtue, to the extent that you are successful with your public relations, you can be a backstabber successfully, and that's in large part what's going on.
So it seems now that almost every tool, so you mentioned ad hominem arguments, muddying the waters, just skepticism almost for the sake of skepticism, every sort of intellectual tool that can be used to undermine the principles of the Enlightenment and the modern era is being used. So then I'm going to come to Lou on this and say, is it fair to say that we are engaged in a war of ideas? And if so, are universities the sort of key battleground for this war of ideas?
Well, of course they are. And this is a civil war that's been raging in different ways in different Western countries, but with a common denominator that in all cases is cultural Marxism inside the postmodernist Trojan horse, which has been utilized to subvert, to undermine, ultimately to destroy Western civilization, which Trotsky thought was the greatest of all evils. The denial of evidence is one of their mainstays. It's another great mainstay, not only ad hominems. Language has lost all meaning. You had Derrida coming in to deconstruct language on the heels of Lyotard deconstructing meta-narratives, deconstructing paradigms. You also have words losing their meaning, so that anyone who disagrees with someone that a person of color says can be labeled a racist. Someone who disagrees with what a woman says can be labeled a misogynist. This utterly erodes the objective meaning, the shared meaning that language previously had. They've compared Trump to Hitler. This completely destroys any meaning that the word Hitler connotes, as well as the word Trump. So this is just a tool. Let me read you something that Bertrand Russell published in 1943 to shed light on this problem. I quote, Bertrand Russell said, "I am persuaded that there is absolutely no limit in the absurdities that can, by government action, come to be generally believed. Give me an adequate army with power to provide it, with more pay and better food than falls the lot of the average man, and I will undertake within 30 years to make the majority of the population believe that 2 and 2 are 3, that water freezes when it gets hot and boils when it gets cold, or any other nonsense that might serve the interests of the state." So the problem is that these apparatchiks that have been graduated from the postmodern, or rather cultural Marxist indoctrination, instead of a liberal arts education, have gone on to become the high school and grade school teachers, have gone on to become the local politicians, have gone on to become the talking heads on major media. Look what's happened to your Guardian and to BBC. It's the same thing here with the major media. They're all controlled by the left. And so they're all able to tell people, for example, that if we defund the police, we'll have less crime. I mean, this is a patent nonsense that flies in the face of social science, but everything is politicized, as Stephen said. And if you politicize science, my friends, you run the same risk of starving to death as Stalin starved so many people by politicizing Darwinism.
I'm just going to bring Stephen in here, I think.
Yeah, I want to make a supplemental point about the genealogy or the origins of this, and this ties into Ravi's point. So Lou has been hitting hard on the button of Marxism, cultural Marxism, the left, and so forth. And I think that is a huge part of the story. But there's another element that it's not a two-way debate between a kind of classical liberalism, including its education model, and a left-dominated postmodernism or cultural Marxism. And the striking thing is that if you take the big names, even people like Lyotard, who was mentioned, or Michel Foucault, and Derrida, they were men of the left. But if you look at their philosophical training, and they were all PhDs in philosophy, as well as drinking deeply from Marxist and cultural Marxist wells, they were also well schooled in thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt. And the important point here is that none of those guys are on the left from the European perspective. They are considered, and I think rightly so, men of the right and a kind of nationalistic, authoritarian right-wingism. And so, the genealogy then is, Nietzsche becoming, influential in the end of the 1800s, Carl Schmitt, perhaps the most genius legal philosopher of the early 20th century, Martin Heidegger, whatever you think of him. And the Nazis, the National Socialists, loved Nietzsche. Now, whether they interpreted him right on everything, that's another issue, but they loved Nietzsche. Martin Heidegger was a Nazi. Carl Schmitt was a Nazi. Oswald Spengler, who hung out in those circles, was friendly and a man of the right. And so the point here is that there is another debate that we need to attend to that doesn't say that human beings, as the Marxists and the cultural Marxists will say, are born as kind of bits of plasticine or plastic, and they are born into different social groups, and they are molded according to economic interests or molded according to religious interests or language groups. And on all of that, you have and all of that means that your individual mind is not your own. You're merely a vehicle through which these social forces are acting. And so then we just have conflicting social forces, and it's all about social power. You also get a variation on that, starting from a different philosophy that is much more biological in its origin, that will say that we are creatures of instinct, and that our passions and desires are not socially inculcated in us, but rather every person comes along with a biological package, but there are different biological packages. And so if you are a German, you have one biological package that you are, you're part of that stock. If you're Italian or Japanese or African or whatever. So what you then have is racial/ethnic group identities that individuals are born into, and then those also are contesting. And of course, that then also means that any sort of liberal individualism goes out the windows. We're not self-forming individuals in any fundamental way. So what we then have is a three-way debate between kind of an environmental determinist left, a more biological determinist far right, and then any sort of liberal individualism. Now, where this is becoming important in this generation is that many of our cultural activists are no longer arguing that everything is entirely a social construction. Right? If everything was a social construction, then we could declare ourselves to be just about anything, and groups should be androgynously and ethnically molded, and we just get rid of differences and everybody is meant to be the same. But we do find that a kind of right-wing ethno-racialism is coming back, and it's coming from the far right, where people are born into racial groups, ethnic groups. That's not coming from the left, that's coming from the far right. And that's also part of the mess that we find in our universities right now.
Fantastic, thank you. I think you touched on sort of two key points there that I picked. And one is the sort of treatment of the individual in each of those thought structures.
Yes.
And the second is the sort of evolution and history of these ideas and how that's beginning to manifest now in the narrative that we see. What I'd like to do, I think we've sketched out perhaps the philosophical or intellectual background of these ideas. Can we sort of have a look at, on an institutional level, why is it that universities seem to be particularly vulnerable to this type of narrative? And I'm going to come to Lou. I know you sort of signposted a bit towards the financial aspect. So can we explore the financial aspect a little bit?
You want a philosopher to explore the financial aspect? Or
Very briefly.
Well, then we are really in dire straits, aren't we? You're turning to a philosopher of financial analysis. That shows the severity of the predicament. No, Stephen and I are definitely converging here. I just would like to add something, and I will respond to you. But what we're seeing really, Stephen, is I think an alliance of these two of these two different forces. But remember what George Orwell said, that a jackboot in the face is a jackboot in the face, whether it's a left boot or a right boot. At a certain point, totalitarianism from the left and totalitarianism from the right become indistinguishable.
Yep, exactly.
And that, I think, is what we're seeing, because they have traded on Marx and the dialectic of oppression, which they're taught now. They get it with their mother's milk. They're born oppressed, right? And it's white, heterosexual, patriarchal hegemonists who've oppressed everybody else on the planet. And so they're the ones who need to be shot in front of the metaphorical firing squad. That's the Marxist dialectic. And then the Nietzschean revolt of the slaves is the other thing that's happening, which is a more complicated doctrine. They're not all told this because they can't all quite digest it. So back to you. In the institutions, you want to understand that basically it's become monolithic, and it is partly driven by money, but they're going to lose if that's what really drives them. They're definitely going to end up losing. Because what's happened in the wake of 2008 in the US already was that public institutions were a beneficiary. A lot of parents are being bankrupted, sending their kids to no-name, very expensive private colleges to have them, again, turned into potted plants, social activist warriors, people who can make no fundamentally useful contributions in society. But one of the dangers on the overemphasis of STEM, and I'm a big fan of STEM, and I think we need to think scientifically and technology and free of politics, very difficult. We need more humanities too. We have to work on both sides of the brain. We're bicameral beings. And yes, we need to work on the left brain in order to develop STEM and good science and solve our technological problems with more technology and more problems. But we need never neglect our artistic, humanistic sides. And the culture is, in a sense, too diagnostic, which is really another topic. So what we can do in the universities is to reinstate humanistic education, that's another name for liberal arts, and make sure that we get less siloed. This problem of the two cultures and the tremendous administrative silos that exist early, pushing into specialization, is really catastrophic for developing the whole person and turning out scientists with a great appreciation of art and artists with a great appreciation of science. I think we need both. It's not either or. So that's one contribution.
Thank you. So we're just about 5 minutes away from our audience Q&A, and I can see them pouring in. There's plenty of interesting questions. So for our audience at home, do keep them coming. And Stephen, I'd like to come to you you have a lot of experience in the intellectual space, the academic space. How do you see going forward universities constructing a sort of effective immune system to these ideas? What sort of structures and institutions are required, if any?
Well, the three most important constituents in a university are the faculty, the students, and the administrators. And so for a university to function well, each part has to be functioning well as well. So I'm going to start with the faculty, because the faculty is the most important cause over the last three generations. As these postmodern and critical theory ideas came into power and prominence in the 60s and 70s, they became tenured and institutionalized in the 80s and 90s and replicated themselves in graduating the next generation of PhDs who are now the young professors. And then as we get into the first two generations, then we get people who are wanting to institutionalize it, the activists. They know what their theory is and they're going to put it in the street. So bad philosophy got us into this mess. So only good philosophy ultimately is going to save us. So we do need to engage all of the intellectuals and do better this century than philosophers did in the past century. I do think we need more administrators with, to put it bluntly, with backbone, with spine. I don't mean to sound too cynical, but the number of administrators at a number of institutions I'm familiar with who are cowardly in the face of any sort of a moral position. They will just do anything to diffuse it. And then the activist types know this very well. You can make all sorts of outrageous demands and seem very forceful. The administrator wants that problem to go away. They're overworked. And so they will compromise on that. But then they just come back 2 years later with more outrageous demands and they will compromise on that. So we need administrators who are not purely functionary, who understand the philosophy of a liberal arts education and are committed to that mission and what the principles are, and who are willing to push back against the violations of liberal education. Now, to some extent, that means they are beholden to the people who are delivering the funding, and there are lots of feedback loops that can be used there. But again, I think funding is not the most important issue. The most important issue is administrators have to believe in liberal education. That's partly philosophical as well. I think the other thing is students, and I'm actually encouraged here because I think there is something about youth that all young people, they want their lives to be something. They want it to be significant. When they go off to university, they are typically the more ambitious, right, of the students, aside from those who are starting their own businesses because they already know what they want to do or embarking on their artistic careers. And so when they come into universities, I think there is a sorting that goes on fairly quickly, that the healthy students, they take some humanities courses, realize what a diseased atmosphere that is, and they go away. They go into some other fields. And the ones that stay, I tend to think, are ones that already have some psychological baggage that predisposes them toward a more jaded, nihilistic, victim understanding of who they are. So I can't see this sustaining itself across some generations. That said, universities still are the places, and I think they're going to continue to be the places for the foreseeable future, where students go to get certified and they get their education. Now that is not to leave totally to the side the idea that if you are a young person and you don't want to just avoid the humanities because a lot of it is crap, you want to get a humanities education. Most young students, young people now do recognize they have lots of other options. They can go online, and there's just a huge amount of amazing stuff out there. So they take their classes, they realize they're getting an indoctrination from one perspective. They can go online and get their genuine education, liberal education, if they are entrepreneurial about it. So that's a three-legged stool.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes just before audience Q&A. I'd like to pick up on what you just said, and sort of, if the sort of, let's say, more switched on, brighter students are steering away from universities, from the humanities, is that not a double-edged sword in that?
Yes, it is.
It is, okay, fine.
Yes.
And then final points, I'd like to come to Lou and say, so recently the British government, they announced they released guidelines for teachers in Britain. And these guidelines stated, what they said was that cancel culture, woke culture, and sort of no platforming is for teachers now. They should teach that as a form of bullying to their children. And this is not university students. This is students who are 18 and below. So what do you see as the role of government in terms of intervening? And is also there a danger whenever a government intervenes in our education system? And that's
well, yes. And this is where I guess I cease being a liberal if part of the classical liberalist tradition, or maybe the more radical aspect of it, believes that government can solve human problems and that by empowering governments we solve our social problems. I disagree. I think it's up to individuals from the grassroots at the end of the day to engender the changes in the movements that actually make a difference in the world. Governments don't solve human problems. Humans solve human problems. I would say that to you. We need to deprogram and depoliticize the curriculum. There's a bias out there with so much online. Research that I've looked at shows that people only watch what confirms the biases they already have. People are not going to watch YouTube because they're looking for an alternative position on something. They're going to watch what confirms the biases they woke up with that morning. So we need to reinstate in the universities is a depoliticized curriculum, and that doesn't happen overnight. The role of government, if it has any role, is not an active role, but rather a preventive or a prophylactic role. They have to make sure that no brainwashing is taking place, not to reinforce the brainwashing that's already taken place. So how do we denazify Germany? Well, that was not easy. but we had an unconditional surrender from them. So we were able to use governmental powers to intervene in the education system and find smart ways of restoring what I would call normalcy to people who had been terribly skewed by a devastatingly toxic propaganda that went on for years. Cultural Marxism has been going on for 40 years or more. The Third Reich only lasted 12. We need governments to do more than they're allowed to do. In the US, it's all governed by states. We need state legislatures and state governors to be willing to empower people to go in there and deprogram what the damage that cultural Marxism has done. That's not going to be a simple task. That's why I said earlier, maybe easier to build on the ashes of this. Maybe wean people away from what is false and destructive and toxic by offering them a wholesome educational alternative, by giving them a philosophy, Stephen, on a different platform, on a new platform, in a new university, or on a new website, like Prager has done, for example, and others, to give them a constructive alternative and then let common sense prevail.
Stephen, would you like to come in? Just one or two remarks before we go to audience Q&A?
Yeah, I'm in the long run, I'm in favor of universities healing themselves. I think university self-government is absolutely critical value. And we know historically the damage, once governments start getting involved, education becomes politicized, and then it's all downhill, right, from that point. There's just innumerable number of examples there. At the same time, I'm sympathetic to the argument that says if we are in a democratic republic and for whatever reasons we've committed to a significant amount of government funding for higher education, politicians are responsible to their citizens to make sure that the education dollars are spent well. So it's an irresolvable conflict between academic freedom and governments acting responsibly in a democratic society. And at that point, you have to you pick your poison. That's why I would say my efforts are going to be not in the political sphere. My efforts are going to be in the universities healing themselves sphere, and then also encouraging university students and education entrepreneurs to start building alternative platforms to deliver genuine liberal education. We've got the resources, we've got the smarts, we've got the technology to do that. So I think that's the better strategy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to both of you. Really insightful discussion. I'm going to jump into audience Q&A now, and they've been coming in thick and fast. I have 3 pages of questions.
Right.
So we'll pick the best ones. If I can ask you to be sort of relatively quick fire, we'll get through as many of them as we can whilst remaining as earnest as we can with our time constraints. So this one has come in from, and if they've addressed it to a particular speaker, I'll address it. Or if not, I'll open it out and whoever wishes to come in. So this one is open to the floor. So to what extent, this is from Ajay Mistry, to what extent has an illiberal education and funding sources affected the sciences as opposed to the classics? And he sort of qualified this by saying the sciences fundamentally search for the truth through a rigorous scientific process.
Yeah.
Well,
philosophy of science.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say philosophy of science is one of my areas, so I do follow these issues, and we do see the postmoderns, the critical justice type people trying to attack all of the various sciences. So they're making their inroads. So I think we are at the early stages. Fortunately, most people inside and outside of academics are aware of the issues now, unlike say 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So people are quicker to point out the absurd attacks. 1 + 1 = what? Who knows, right? So we have a much more vigorous discussion of those issues sooner. And I think also scientists typically have cleaner intellectual habits than other parts of the academy. So they're going to be more forceful in their response. So the battle is joined, but it's early stages.
Right, and I would agree, except with this caveat that yes, the sciences and engineering, STEM is more naturally resistant because of the robustness and objectivity of their observables and their subject matter. They're more resistant, but the siege engines have been wheeled up because of this other myth I didn't get to, the myth of underrepresentation, where they're trying to achieve Marxist quota systems by admitting people who are unqualified and so forth. So they will weaken the sciences by spending money where it won't give returns. and the social sciences have been totally politicized and colonized. Every study that they turn out is virtually is called an outcome-oriented study, which is the antithesis of science. They've already determined the outcome they want, and then they go out and find or falsify evidence in order to corroborate it. That's nonsense. But unfortunately, the social sciences are riddled with that. Natural science is more resistant.
So we've got a two-pronged answer. The sciences are more resistant, but also they're being subject to different levels of attack, essentially.
Nothing is not politicizable in Marx's theory. Everything has to be politicized, as from day one.
Another resistance here, though, is financial. That in engineering and the sciences, the funding comes from granting agencies, and if it's coming from people who want practical results, they're not going to be funding third-rate scientists and so on. So there is that insulation. So if someone does get appointed for merely demographic reasons, and they're not actually a good scientist, they will be marginalized and ineffective.
Yes, but there's another factor here. I'm sorry to interject, and that is the big technological fact. The technology platforms, we call them the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, add Twitter, add Apple. They are determining what content the public is going to find out about, even if there's good science being done. If they decide it's offensive to some predetermined tenet of the party, they will not allow people to know. They are actually responsible for cancel culture.
Yeah,
and they are
the shift in the institutions outside of higher education. And of course, the same battles will be fought there. My point was only that within the university, their effectiveness will be limited.
Indeed.
So I'm going to come in here and say, so we'll sort of blitz these questions, and then we'll come back to the more interesting one. Let's do it that way. So this kind of touches on where we're going, and it's from Akshaya Rajganam, and I'm going to direct this one to Lou. And she said that, to what extent has the fast service culture contributed to the lack of willingness in seeking information amongst the current generation? And I think that's sort of signposting towards the social media issues that you were talking about.
Did you say fast service culture?
You did say fast service culture. I think
okay, I'll translate that into an American mantra. This is like speed chess now. Okay, 10 seconds. The American mantra is quick and easy. Everything has to be quick and easy because, firstly, they've diluted attention span is so eroded that people can no longer focus for very long on a given issue. That's one problem, because literacy has been undermined as well. The written tradition, which neither of us mentioned today, is at the foundation of all of this stuff, has been replaced by the visual and digital, and this has both advantages and dangers. So this quick and easy culture is the antithesis of the kind of thoughtfulness, the methodological approach, the patient approach that we need to winnowing away falsehoods and getting closer to truth. Okay, so we need to be able to step back and create space and time for ourselves to be able to focus and digest and then reflect. That's not happening much.
So the answer in a sentence that you're saying is we need to step back and reflect individually. Is that
yes,
fair?
and then discuss it in groups. I mean, fast food is like this. You want to have a good meal, cook it. It takes time to prepare. Usually it takes some time, yes, to prepare a culinary dish that's satisfying qualitatively. So that why would ideas be any different? They take time. A mantra or a slogan doesn't work.
So next question, I'm going to address this one to Stephen. It's come from Prover. He said, what do the panelists make of the movements to decolonize university curriculums?
Yeah, well, I think that's an anti-concept, the one related to what Lou was mentioning earlier in his example of Trump, right, and Hitler. Decolonize is a misnomer for what's going on inside the university. There is no colonization, right? Unless we want to take seriously the hypothesis that Lou and I have been arguing that we have been colonized by postmodernism, and that is what needs to be decolonized. But typically, I think what the person means is we have a Western ideology that's not true. It's not any better than any others. It's just that they've got all of the big guns, and so they're going and overpowering women, overpowering other ethnicities and races and so forth, and forcing them to adopt their no better than any other ideology. Now, if that's what is meant by colonization, and then we want to decolonize, then I would say that's just an inappropriate analysis. The argument is going to be for Western, whatever you want to call it, is not that it is Western, And the argument for science is not that it was developed by white guys. And the argument for whatever is not anything to do with race, gender, class, et cetera, because we know there are people who have been brilliant achievers in all demographics, however you want to slice it. And among whatever European white male group, there are any number of people who can't think their way out of a wet paper bag, to use an earthy old metaphor and so on. So the standard should not be any sort of gender, race, ethnic, religious demographics. The standard should be, is this a good idea or not? And the standards for, is it a good idea or not, is, what's the nature of the evidence for it? What kind of experiments have been done for it? How fruitful is this as a research program? And that then is to say, if a program, whatever field, can meet those criteria, then that's what we do in the universities. We need to totally obliterate the idea that any sort of affirmative action is appropriate.
Fantastic. Thank you. So next question is directed towards Luke. It's come from Niti. She said that some people may say, so it doesn't sound like it's her opinion, she's already distanced herself from it. Some people may say that cancel culture exists to protect society's vulnerable. What is your take on that?
Cancel culture is making us all vulnerable to further and more pervasive indoctrination and nothing else. It is shutting down all possible debate on all possible issues by declaring that there's only one morally appropriate view, and that the purveyors of these platforms and that the administrators of these universities know what it is, and their business is to indoctrinate us all with it, and dissent will not be tolerated. That is a hallmark of totalitarianism, is not a hallmark of a free, open, prosperous, and wholesome society.
Yes.
So I have a follow-up question, but I'll save it to the end and see if we can get through some more audience ones. So this one is from Kamlesh. He says, how does the balance of rights versus responsibilities come into play in this discussion? Of liberal versus conservative. And then he's equivocated it to sort of liberal versus conservative and postmodern versus enlightenment. But let's focus on the first part of that question. So how does the balance of rights versus responsibilities come into play in this discussion?
Yeah.
And I'm going to get to on this one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. In my analysis, rights are a social political concept, and they come out of the modern Enlightenment tradition, which is individualistic. So the position is, your life is yours, your mind is yours, your agency in the world is yours, and you should then, and this is actually first the responsibility point, be robustly self-responsible. You need to take charge of your economic life, your religious life, your family life, make your own choices, go forth in the world. So the concept then of rights as it evolved in the modern world is a corollary of that. How are we going to have a large number of self-responsible free agents in a social context? And rights is then meant to carve out the space within which self-responsible individuals can function freely. So it's not like a balance in the sense that they are two countervailing forces. Rather, the whole idea of rights is to say your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness, your justly acquired property is yours, and that sets a boundary to what I can do with respect to you. And part of my social responsibility then is to respect your rights, just as your social responsibility is to respect my rights, so that we can be free agents.
So to some extent, this cancel culture, by definition, is being irresponsible and not respecting people's rights.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a wholesale assault on the individual, on the notion of responsibility. Notice it's a profoundly irresponsible motion because it says everybody is not responsible. We're all victims of forces beyond our control, and so we can't be responsible. And also that is meant to legitimate all of the very vicious attacks that you can mount on anyone. So you can call anyone any bad name you want to and get away with it. There will be no sanctions for you. That's a totally irresponsible, it's a blank check for sadism, and that's what we have.
Lovely. That's very, very unequivocal. So the next question we've got is from Saroj Mistry, and it's addressed to Lou. And he said, Lou talks about underrepresentation, but is there really equal representation of certain minority groups in academia? And if not, how do we go about addressing this?
Well, I will deny that there's a problem, you see, and I think what I didn't get a chance to expound upon was this really important notion that equal opportunity inevitably leads to unequal outcomes, but does not mean that there's an injustice in the works. And this is the thing people need to get their minds around, especially those who've been oppressed by a system which has taught them that they're oppressed when they're actually not. How in heaven's name could we ever have elected a black president in the United States? How do we have black judges, black mayors, black police chiefs, black professors, black doctors, black lawyers, black members of Congress and the Senate, and as well as athletes and celebrities? So ever since civil rights was actually put into effect and with teeth in the 60s, then African Americans have taken advantage, most of the ones who are capable, and that's a huge majority, and not including the silent moral majority. They've taken tremendous advantage of these opportunities, just like every other immigrant, only of course they were brought against their wills. But since they were put on a level playing field, they've achieved magnificent results. How could a racist country have elected a black president? Nonsense. Could not have happened in South Africa during apartheid, because that was a racist regime, explicitly, not implicitly. So while you may find a bigot in the woods, always you're going to find some bigots. Yes, that doesn't mean that one bigot makes a country racist, because okay, so do you understand what I'm coming to? Equal opportunity has to be a given thing, but it will always lead. If we all run a race, Ravi, we're not all going to finish first.
Absolutely.
Well, and then that's the end of the story, and there's no injustice in it.
Just to push
let people discover their excellence, what Aristotle would say, and I'll say it to your questioner. Each of us has some individual excellence, be it athletic, be it intellectual, be it social, be it whatever. Find your excellence, and only in an education system that encourages flourishing and openness will you be free to explore avenues that will help you discover your excellence, then develop it in a virtuous pathway, and you will be a happy, wholesome, productive human being.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We don't need quota systems to measure justice.
Indeed. I'm just going to push back a little bit, and I'm going to address this one to Stephen and say that the postmodern education system, or those who sort of subscribe to that narrative, have occupied a particular position, particular narrative. That is, we fight for equality, and we fight for equality of whether it be opportunity or outcome. So let's say that there is a genuine lack of equality of opportunity in a particular case. How do we then go about addressing that earnestly without slipping into this sort of postmodern equality of outcome that should exist?
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely has been part of the modern Enlightenment liberal project from the beginning. And there the point was, there was a lack of equality of opportunity legally and culturally ensconced, right? So if you were in the wrong religion, you could not hold certain offices and so forth. And so the point there was a double standard in the law, and in some cases there was a double standard in the social ethos. You mount an intellectual attack on both of them, and you change the law so that members of all religions can do whatever it is that they are going to do. And part and parcel of that is, even if you find members of other religions, their views to be odious, you have a cultural tolerance that is part of your social education process as well. And that was one of the early battles in the modern Enlightenment. So you leave individuals free to find their own way in the world. The same thing then was applied to political issues. If we're going to have a democratic republic, everybody needs to be able to vote in the process. Everyone needs to be able to participate in the process. So you get rid of the legal double standards there. When we realize that women also are intelligent individuals with passions and dreams and agency, and that culturally and legally forever there have been double standards in place, we do social education, we get rid of the legal double standards, and then women go on to achieve great heights. The same thing with respect to slavery, with respect to ethnicity, and so on. So if there is a formal barrier to opportunity that does not enable the individual freely to go down their road, we should be vigorous in attacking that. And the modern Enlightenment world has the best track record ever historically in going after exactly those ones. So what you find, though, is, I don't want to monopolize too much, that the postmoderns don't believe in any of that. Right? And so they're coming at it from a very different language. So when they talk about equality, it really is a very different concept altogether.
Lovely. We're just coming to our closing remarks. So I'm going to ask you both the final question. If you can sort of summarize it in 3 sentences, this is the challenge. At the risk of being intellectually shortened, let's say. In 3 sentences, are there sort of guiding principles? So Lou will be familiar with the concept of dharma. And in that, for something to be true, it has to be sustainable. It has to lead to the individual and society flourishing. So they would sort of be the guidelines. But from your point of view, are there guidelines that we could use to gauge whether something is truthful or not when exploring this space?
We have to ask.
And then we'll finish with Stephen. If 3 sentences, if you can.
About truth? Well, all right, 3 sentences, better than none. Look, if we're talking about logical truth or mathematical truth, then no one in his right mind disputes that 1 + 1 or 2 in a decimal 10 system. No one disputes the Pythagorean theorem. This is something which crosses cultures, and it points to a very important idea, namely that these fundamental things, as well as scientific laws, be they Newton's laws or Darwin's laws or whoever's laws, if they're robustly and demonstrably true, either in logic or in empirical fact, then they transcend sex, gender, race, ethnicity, culture. They're true for all humans. We're all subject to the law of gravity. Doesn't matter what you believe, yeah? So there's that kind of truth. And then there are other kinds of truths which are much more slippery and much more debatable, and which I would say are more subjective, and Aristotle would agree. So would Plato, probably.
Thank you.
So you're asking me a very difficult question.
It is a difficult
truth in 3 sentences. I have to pass the buck. I can only tell you that some truths are indisputable, and others can only be clarified if we have open inquiry and free speech.
Fantastic. Thank you. I knew I was taking the risk of being intellectually sort of unearnest, let's say. Stephen, if I can invite you for your sort of 3 guiding principles. Let's say somebody's reading, and what would guide them?
All right. I would say first, for older people, professors, educators, administrators, members of the parents, members of the general public, be courageous. Right? The battle is on. We know what the important values are, and you may not be an expert in all of these areas, but it is a battle, and you have to fight for what you believe to the best of your ability. Whatever your conception of truth, justice, objectivity is, go for it in your decent way. To younger people, these are the ones I think about the most, probably because I'm a professor. I would say if we take the divide between kind of majority groups and minority groups, the concept here is probably self-esteem is the most important one. Realize, even if you're a member of a majority group, you have got lots of advantages as a result of being born into this magnificent civilization that we all are a part of. Be grateful for that and use all of the tools that are available to do something special with your life. And don't let those who want to undercut your sense of self-esteem, your sense of worth, the sense that your life matters with all of this unearned guilt based on your heritage, shrug all of that off. Don't have anything to do with it. For the groups, if you're an individual and you're a member of a traditional minority group, and of course they have grievances, historically they've been beaten up on, right, and so forth, what I would say is, again, self-esteem. Don't let group histories define who you are as an individual. Wherever you start in the world right now, you have a brain, you have lots of opportunities, you have your special talents, and there are lots of good-willed people out there who want to work with you and help them. Find those people who claim to be your agent and want you to be a victim and be angry and so forth. They are not your friends. They are going to disempower you, right? Go your own way, find your own voice.
Okay, so finally we've got 2 minutes each for your closing remarks. brief again, and I know that's going to be tough. So we'll start with Lou, and I will keep you to 2 minutes on this one. And then we'll end with Stephen. So 2 minutes on your closing remarks and the takeaways that you would like our audience to leave with.
All right. The takeaways are that this problem is much more deep-seated than perhaps some people have given credit for, and both Stephen and I have endeavored during this session to be informative and to be helpful in pointing out some of the historical roots and the ideas that have led to our current crisis. So just because suddenly you're dismayed by what you see on cancel culture doesn't mean that this problem has not been brewing for decades. And it's like a volcano, you know, it's slowly, the pressure builds up and then suddenly one day it erupts, but that didn't happen overnight. What was really going on for the longest time was taking place in a subterranean space. And for us, that's behind the ivy curtain. I'm working behind the ivy curtain, okay, which has been lowered across the academy wholesale. What people need to understand is that these really destructive and insidious and seditious forces that want to destroy Western civilization prey on our virtues, not our vices. And they have this in common with the destructive radical jihadists. You know, they destroyed the World Trade Center, and I watched it happen. They didn't destroy the French Quarter in New Orleans. They didn't destroy the pig farms in South Carolina. Right? Those would have been vices from that perspective. Why didn't they destroy what they deemed to be vices? Because much more profitable to prey on people's virtues. Similarly, the only way this cancer got ensconced, because it is opportunistic, it got ensconced in the universities because of our virtues of freedom of open-ended inquiry. And it used that as a lever to shut us down. And this is what people need to understand.
There we have it. Thank you very much, Professor.
Stick with it. Assert yourself. Don't be bullied by them into silence.
Thank you. Very clear message. These sort of ideas, they prey on our need for virtue. You know, I can invite Stephen Hick for his closing remarks.
Okay, well, first I want to say, well said, Lou, and I thank you for that. I think all of us, academics or not, need to be aware that there is a civil war that is going on. It's the battle for the soul of civilization, and it's all of civilization. So it really is a fight. And because we are cognitive creatures, we have a big brain, we are smart if we choose to use it. That's where the battle is being fought. It's a battle over ideas. And I would say that for each of us then individual, pay very careful attention, just as we are careful of what kind of foods we put in our body for nutrition, what ideas we let into our minds and which ones become the furniture of our minds and the operating resources. Now, as bad as things are in some subsectors in our society, I do think overall we live in wonderful times, and we do need to balance ourselves psychologically in the sense of being up to speed on where the cancers are, where the sicknesses are, and why, and being willing to fight when we have to fight. But I would say what should dominate our thinking, right, whether you are an academic or a non-academic, is doing the work of appreciating and advancing the magnificent civilization that we have created. We are wealthier. We live in a cleaner world. We live in a more tolerant, peaceful world than has ever existed in human history. The opportunities for people in all demographics are astounding. And the willingness of people to work with members of other genders, other races, other ethnicities, and so forth is unprecedented. We have the ideas, we have the wealth, we have the technology. We still have the social space to both appreciate and continue the great fight for civilization. I think we will win. I think it will be ugly for the next 10 or 15 years, but I'm an optimist.
Fantastic. Final point, we will win. Thank you both for joining us today. I've had the, let's say, unenviable task of having to keep this to time. And I think I could go on with this discussion. I've enjoyed it and I've learned a lot. I think what I've really pulled from what the two of you have said is that there is a responsibility for the individual, and that we shouldn't, you know, the individual should maintain that internal locus of control. From your guidance, that we should be fearless in our approach to the truth. And really, you know, if it is true then it should be true for everybody. And that's really interesting. And finally, this thing that this is a civil war of ideas, and I think both of you have said it, and that for us to sort of deal with this, and although as Stephen said, we are living in a fantastic time, there is an issue that we need to deal with. And for ideas to flourish in society, they really need four things. They need people who elucidate them and expound them. They need time from those people. They need money or funding, as we've covered. And they need institutions, whether that be universities or platforms or think tanks. They need all four of these to sort of effectively begin to engage and win this war. I'd like to end the discussion there. So thank you both again to Professor Stephen Hicks and Professor Lou Marinoff. It's an honor to have you on this platform, and we hope we can have you back again to continue this discussion. Thank you to you, our audience at home, for getting involved. There's a few questions I didn't manage to answer, so if you're still interested, feel free to tweet both of our speakers. They're very active on social media. If you'd like to get involved with Vichar Manthan, then you can head over to our website. There's a few ways of getting involved. You can get involved with our Well Wishers Foundation, who essentially fund the activities that Vichar Manthan do. You can get involved with our book clubs. We run book clubs up and down the country. Currently, they're virtual because of coronavirus that you can get involved with. Or if you'd like to get involved with our teams and organizing the next Vichar Manthans, do let us know. Finally, coming up, I'd like to signpost you to our next event. We have, just coming up on your screens, Is My Mother Tongue Worth Preserving? This will be a fireside discussion, so slightly shorter, and that's on Saturday, the 31st of October at 7 p.m. Thank you very much. Namaste and good night.